Hello, everybody. For folks joining, we'll get started in about 1 minute. Hello, everyone. My name is Madison Calhoun. I'm Manager of Educational Programs here at the Environmental Law Institute. I'm delighted to welcome you to ELI's first webinar in a new series. We're so excited to kick off our new monthly PFAS briefing series. Today's first session is titled Introducing the PFAS Deskbook. ELI has recently published the PFAS Deskbook with Marten Law. The PFAS Deskbook offers readers a comprehensive overview of federal and state PFAS regulation and litigation nationwide. However, staying on top of the legal and policy developments in the PFAS arena is no small task, as updates are rapidly being released. So, in an effort to provide our members with the latest updates in relation to PFAS, ELI has started a new series with author of the PFAS Deskbook, James Pollack, and national experts on PFAS to keep you up to date, answer your questions, and highlight a unique topic related to PFAS during each session. The series will be taking place on the fourth Tuesday of each month from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Typically, the series will be for ELI members only, although non-members will be able to join for a small fee. However, in celebration of the start of the series, we've made this session publicly available. In the future, though, you will need to be an ELI member or pay a small fee to join these webinars. All webinars in the series will also be recorded and made publicly available or made available for members on the ELI website for members to view later. You can find more information about ELI membership at eli.org. Although today's recording will be publicly available, so if you can't make it to this whole session, you'll be able to watch the recording later. Today's session of the series will focus on the launch of the PFAS Deskbook. We will also have a roundtable discussion about PFAS with recent federal and state PFAS regulations with two panelists. Following the roundtable discussion, our speakers will be taking some audience questions later in the program. Please don't wait to submit any questions you have, though. You can go ahead and use Zoom's Q&A function at any time throughout the webinar, and our moderator and speakers will be able to see it. So we encourage you to use that at any point to submit your questions. We also have the chat open, and we encourage you to use that to post any observations throughout today's event, but please be aware that we'll be putting discussion questions from the Q&A box into our speakers, or we'll be giving the questions to our speakers, so they will be able to see them only from the Q&A box, not the chat. Finally, we're excited to provide everyone who has joined today's webinar a discount code to purchase the PFAS Deskbook. We welcome you to use the code Pollack15, which I'll put in the chat, and it's also on our slide here, to purchase the book through the West Academic Online Bookstore. Now, before we get started, I want to introduce our wonderful moderator today, James Pollack. James will be moderating each session of this series. James is an attorney at Marten Law, where he leads the firm's consumer products regulatory practice. He helps consumer product manufacturers in the apparel, outdoor gear, furniture, and food product industries who are working to understand the complicated and shifting regulatory and litigation environments surrounding emerging contaminants. As the lead author of the PFAS Deskbook published, James has gained extensive knowledge on PFAS regulatory compliance at the federal and state level. James, I will go ahead and hand things over to you. Thank you so much, everybody, for being here today.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Madison, and welcome everyone to the first monthly PFAS briefing. This monthly webinar series will be a place to learn about all things PFAS as we keep up to date with current events, feature panel discussions that convene experts from an array of fields in the law to just talk about PFAS. Future sessions will cover subjects like the AFFF multi-district litigation in South Carolina, the hazardous waste designation of PFOA and PFOS, community impacts of PFAS manufacturing domestically and abroad, personal injury litigation across the country, consumer product regulations, food regulations, and more. To kick off this series, I could not be more excited about the panel that we have today, including J. Simone Jones, partner at Sidley Austin, as well as Avi Carr, senior attorney and senior director, toxics at NRDC. They're here to help give a sort of PFAS 101 of sorts as we catch up on the last year since the PFAS Deskbook was written. There's been quite a bit of activity already, and I'm sure that there are a lot of folks on this call who actually have never heard of PFAS, or maybe have heard of PFAS but don't know what's going on with it. We're hoping to give you a reason to pay attention going forward. The impetus for this webinar, as Madison mentioned, is the PFAS Deskbook, which is out in stores now. It's an omnibus resource on all things PFAS. And at a basic level, it follows PFAS chemicals from their manufacture to their use in industrial or consumer product settings, into the environment, and into their eventual cleanup. We plan over the course of the year to provide periodic updates because PFAS world is always changing. And part of that effort to update folks on what's going on are these webinars. There's constant movement in the world of PFAS, and we want to provide a resource and a convening space for the legal community to grapple with these forever chemicals. So without further ado, I think we can dive into the topic at hand. And I hate to start with something so simple, Avi, but what exactly are PFAS?
PFAS are a huge class of chemicals that are used for a variety of uh, purposes in commercial applications and in consumer products. And they are found in virtually all of us. They are defined as in most state laws as a class of chemicals that contain at least one carbon-fluorine bond. And there's a definition that is being used in about 22 states at the moment. And I'll just read it out to you. It says PFAS chemicals mean a class of fluorinated organic chemicals containing at least one fully fluorinated carbon atom. This is used, as I mentioned, in 22 different states. It's also being used in some federal laws. And it is consistent with the definition that is being used by the OECD, which I can't remember the full version of. That is the most broadly used definition of PFAS that is out there. There are some other definitions out there that are problematic. For instance, the EPA is using a definition in the reporting rule under TSCA that doesn't land in any particular place. It's almost like we'll know it when we see it. Almost, they're going to evaluate it on a case by case basis to some degree, and I think that's problematic. Fundamentally, at NRDC, we believe PFAS and PFAS is a very broad class of chemicals. We should treat them as a class so that we're not moving into other problematic PFAS. And then think about how we regulate them from there. So one thing to note about the PFAS is that they are often called forever chemicals because they last in the environment for a very long time. They're persistent. They don't break down easily. They're also very mobile to move around easily in the environment, and they're associated with a whole host of health impacts, from cancer to kidney disease to interference with vaccine uptake to a bunch of other harms. And they're harmful at very, very low levels for the ones that we know about. In the range of, to the point that EPA is talking about regulating them in water in parts per trillion. And so, I think hopefully that gives you a sense of what these are. And let me tell you exactly where they're used as examples as well. So some products they're used in that you might have heard about: nonstick cookware, stain resistant clothing, stain resistance on things like furniture, industrial applications where they use to provide the ability to for some instances, it's for flame retardants. In other cases, it's to provide lubrication, etc. So there are a whole variety of uses out there, lots of different kinds of applications, and it's ubiquitous and found almost everywhere, and almost all of us have it in our bodies. So
Yeah, I think what's interesting about this chemistry compared to other sort of chemicals that have gone through the gauntlet of regulation, litigation, is that this is a family of chemicals. We have, instead of one chemical, we say it's lead. We know what lead is. Lead has this chemical structure and it has these impacts based off of these studies. Is that PFAS are this family. We often hear the term, it's a family of chemicals. They're chemicals that are similar in structure, depending on the definition that you use, anywhere from 8,000 to 10,000 to 12 to 13,000 chemicals, some subset of which are used in the economy. And these chemicals are similar in some ways, they're different in other ways, but they have really similar properties that provide these useful qualities, and that's why they've been utilized. But it turns out there's this other half to it, as we're coming around to understand, along with nonstick cookware and these wonderful applications. There's also these health impacts that are becoming really clear, especially with these legacy, these older PFAS chemicals, PFOA, PFOS, PFOA, or PFOS. You'll start to hear a lot of these chemicals have similar names, a lot of puff sounds. Simone, to bring you into this, what sorts of uses out there? Avi mentioned a few of the applications that we've heard about. What other types of applications for these chemicals are there in the industrial space, in the consumer product space?
Sure. And just to hit a couple of points home, and you touched on these, just to put a finer point, the focus generally has been on two particular types of PFAS substances, PFOA or PFOA and PFOS or PFOS. Those are known as what are called long chain PFAS substances. These are thought to be more toxic, I would say, than sort of the shorter chain or analogs. They're short chain, meaning 6 or less carbons, long chains, meaning 8 or more carbons. There's also been, to a lesser degree, focus on PFNA, another PFAS substances. But to the point that was made earlier, there are thousands of PFAS substances out there. Estimates range from maybe 5,000 all the way up to 9,000 substances. Avi made the point about PFAS substances of which we are aware currently. But PFAS substances generally are known for their hydrophobic and oleophobic characteristics, which generally means that they repel water and oil, and they also can withstand high temperatures. So as a result, PFAS are alleged to be found or used in industrial applications. Avi named some: coatings for textiles, paper products, plastics, packaging, semiconductors, and really across industrial sectors. The aerospace industry, the chemical industry, obviously, the pharmaceutical industry. So in addition, PFAS substances have been found in consumer products, clothing, for example, car seats, personal protective equipment, food packaging, cosmetics, and protein powder, just to name a few. And that the presence in those products is owing, at least in part, to those characteristics that I discussed at the outset, which are known as distinguishing characteristics for PFAS substances.
And if I may add in here, there is a distinction often made between long chain and short chain PFAS, but it's a distinction that I think is a little outdated at this point in time. The broad definitions of PFAS that I outlined incorporate both long and short chain PFAS, because increasingly we're finding health impacts associated with short chain PFAS. And the idea that only long chain PFAS are harmful is no longer accepted in the broader scientific community. The OECD definition doesn't make that distinction. The state definitions don't make that distinction. California's biomonitoring program, California's Department of Toxic Substances Control have all got definitions that look at the broad class of PFAS, partly because when you make PFAS, whatever kind of PFAS they are, whether they're polymers or whether they're short chains, you use and produce PFAS, and they break down into, or you're using the smaller PFAS as a building block too. And so you are actually creating all sorts of PFAS as you go. And there are concerns associated with all of them at this point.
Sure, and obviously, I would just caveat that by saying, obviously, that's not a position I agree with, but I think we can move on. I don't want to spend I don't want to take the focus away sort of from the broader discussion today on PFAS substances.
No, and I think what this highlights is the movement within the world of PFAS. I mean, the fact that even the definition of PFAS is a contested point, and that's part of why EPA's definition, which includes structural features, the utilization of certain types of chemical groups attached to that carbon fluorine bond. It's an attempt to understand what is and what is within and without the definition, in order to try to tailor that definition based off of certain uses. I've seen, for instance, I know that there are members of the pharmaceutical industry that are focused on using the carbon fluorine as the sole definition would potentially qualify Flonase, for instance, or any number of other medications as PFAS, whether those should or should not be essential uses, which we can talk about later in this discussion. I think that there are different ways that people are approaching even the definition of PFAS, which is truly unique among regulated chemicals. And I think what this raises is sort of why I think this is an important briefing for us to be having. PFAS are a really fascinating topic because they intersect with so many aspects of environmental law. They essentially act as a prism through which we can view federal regulations, state regulations, litigation, drinking water, personal injury, greenwashing. PFAS are unique in their breadth of reach, where with other chemicals, there tended to be a clear set of uses. It's, okay, you have asbestos, it's used in these applications only, and it has this chemistry, and this is how it works. With PFAS, we have such a broader set of uses and a broader set of products and potential applications here, as well as the mobile qualities, the persistent qualities that lead to, it seems like every day I see new research finding PFAS in, I think last week I saw penguins. So it seems like every week there's some sort of new research showing the pervasiveness of this chemistry in extremely remote places even. Simone, as we are thinking about PFAS in our work as environmental lawyers, can you tell me a little bit about how your clients are thinking about PFAS, or how is PFAS coming up in your work?
Sure. So clients are obviously PFAS substances are on the top of our clients' minds, just like probably the rest of the world at this point, just given how much PFAS substances dominate the media. And specifically, we're hearing concerns from clients about the patchwork regulatory regime between the federal and state governments, and even within the states themselves. I think Avi touched on that a little bit at the outset, and probably we'll talk about that a little more, just even as we're looking at how PFAS substances are defined. There's also, and we'll get into, this will be a little more apparent once we start talking about some of the regulations or some of the example regulations. There's also a concern that companies, even companies that don't add PFAS to their products, can be held liable if those products break down into PFAS in the environment, and or if those PFAS substances are an unintended byproducts of a manufacturing process. So those are some of the things that are top of mind. We'll touch a little bit, I think, later on, perhaps, in some of the specific regulatory attempts, specifically the maximum contaminant level proposed MCLs. And so that introduces another set of considerations for clients, but we can get to that later on.
No, thank you so much. And Avi, I'm sure in your work in the toxics program at NRDC, PFAS is top of mind. what could you tell us a little bit about NRDC's efforts in this space and how NRDC is thinking about this as well?
Yeah, so yes, PFAS is one of the priority areas that we work on in the toxics program or the toxics sector in at NRDC. The kinds of things we're focused on is is a twofold approach, really. Treating PFAS as a class so that we're not dealing with them one at a time and we're not moving from one problematic chemical to another. And the second is the essential use framework to give us a framework for eliminating um, avoidable uses of PFAS. I think PFAS are PFAS. We should deal with them as such and then figure out where we really need to use them so that we're not using them where they're not needed. And we should be trying to get rid of them wherever possible because they pose a lot of concerns.
And I'm already seeing some questions in the Q&A, and people should feel free to submit questions in the Q&A. Some questions about currently unavoidable uses and essential uses. I'm going to cabin that for when we get to the state regulations, which some of them are incorporating those ideas directly into statute, but just previewing that we will get to that and plugging the Q&A box. But I think it's useful for us to go ahead and dive into some of the big regulations that have been happening over the last couple of years. I think in writing the PFAS Deskbook, I was struck by the way that this became sort of a primer on all of environmental law as we come to recognize that these chemicals have implications across each of our core environmental laws at the federal level. I think it's been challenging for the last two administrations to really get their arms around the PFAS problem and to understand what should be done at a sort of unified level. Simone, could you just at a basic level, what does sort of the federal agenda look like related to PFAS?
Sure. So EPA has ramped up its oversight of PFAS substances. In October of 2021, it announced its PFAS strategic roadmap. And that roadmap has guided a lot of its efforts and initiatives since that time. So it's a 3-year roadmap, and it sets forth actions that EPA intends to take to, quote, research, restrict, and remediate PFAS. So the 3 R's. And in addition, it provides a timeline for EPA to achieve certain milestones using this whole of EPA approach, which is sort of a nod to President Biden's general whole of administration approach. So just wanted to touch on a couple of things relative to the roadmap. First, the roadmap states that EPA will conduct research to understand how PFAS substances contribute to the cumulative burden of pollution in communities with environmental justice concerns. As most, if not all of you on this Zoom know, the administration has focused pretty intently on environmental justice. So this is just consistent with those efforts. The roadmap also states that EPA will use and harmonize actions under all available statutory authorities to control and prevent PFAS contamination and minimize exposure to PFAS during consumer and industrial uses. And then under that third R, remediate, the roadmap states that EPA will, among other things, maximize responsible party performance and funding for investigations and cleanup of PFAS contamination. So this includes designating PFAS as a hazardous substance under CERCLA. And just to talk a little bit about CERCLA, EPA issued a notice of proposed rulemaking to designate PFOA or PFOA and PFOS or PFOS as hazardous substances under CERCLA. So notably, this proposed rulemaking is EPA's first time employing its power to designate new chemicals as hazardous substances under CERCLA since the law was enacted. The rule is not final just yet. There's some delays, but if the rule does become final, it would require facilities across the country to report on PFOA and PFOS releases that meet or exceed the reportable quantity set under CERCLA. The rule would also force responsible parties to take remedial actions and to pay for the cleanup of contaminated sites. One point to raise, although EPA does not have the authority to exempt particular entities from liability, the agency is preparing to address these types of concerns with various enforcement tools, including the issuance of new policy documents such as an enforcement discretion policy.
Yes,
Yeah.
Simone, if you don't mind, I think this is such an interesting feature of the CERCLA designation that you pointed out. I can't think of a chemical that's so ubiquitous that it could potentially have implications for every Superfund site across the country, for every water system across the country. I know that it sounds like, okay, there's going to be EPA enforcement guidance. What does that mean? But it's because EPA is responding to this broad groundswell of folks wondering, well, is my water system going to be designated as a Superfund site? Is my municipal waste facility going to be designated as a Superfund site? And I've heard that David Ullman, the head of enforcement at EPA, talk about this as a concern that they're highlighting, and that's part of why this enforcement discretion is going to become such an issue. I'm hoping that we're going to have a future conversation just focused on this enforcement piece. So I'm so glad you brought this up. So thank you.
Sure. And then there's also TSCA. And James, I know you do TSCA work, so maybe this is something that you can speak to, just the significant new use rule.
Yeah, and with TSCA, there's kind of a few different mechanisms embedded there. And on the front end, there's the pre-manufacture notice process, where before introducing chemicals into the economy, you have to provide certain information and reporting to EPA. There have been repeated updates to the pre-manufacture notice, the significant new use rule process by EPA regarding PFAS, where they've added more and more PFAS to the list that you have to provide notice before manufacturing or importing. The idea is to, once certain PFAS are phased out of the economy, for instance, PFOA, which we've talked about quite a bit here, was phased out through voluntary agreements with EPA back in like 2003. Once certain chemistry is phased out, to prevent its reentry into the market, you have to provide these kinds of notifications before adding. So there's that mechanism, which continues to be updated. And even, I think 2 weeks ago, there was a new update announced, which is part of why the desk book is going to take quite a bit to update. But on the other end, there's also this really interesting mechanism that Congress required, which was to report on PFAS manufactured in the United States, as well as imported in articles to the United States, going back from 2011 to the end of 2022. And this reporting rule, which is pretty unique in its scope and in its application, it's going to cover all kinds of product manufacturers that haven't had to report or may have no familiarity with TSCA. It's going to create a huge data set as well, which is going to be really interesting as PFAS are added to all these rules. You mentioned the sort of reporting requirements that come with CERCLA designation. There are reporting requirements under EPGRA and under TSCA. These data sets are going to help create a lot of visibility on where PFAS is in the economy, as well as where exposure burdens are potentially arising. So it's a really fascinating time. We're going to have a future webinar just highlighting the reporting obligation for manufacturers and consumer product manufacturers. So look out for that next webinar. But just know that this huge data set is going to be created in the next 2 years. And we'll see how EPA decides to use that data set going forward.
All right. So as you can see, a flurry of activity. There's also RCRA, and I don't profess to be a RCRA attorney, but I just for the sake of completeness, I'll touch on that. And just the anticipated, the proposed rulemaking to add PFOA and PFOS and PFBS, as well as some Gen X substances, which are a subset of PFAS chemicals, to RCRA's list of hazardous constituents. But I think perhaps one of the things that has the most eyes on it, I guess, would be EPA's proposed maximum contaminant levels in drinking water pursuant to the Safe Drinking Water Act. So in March of last year, EPA proposed to establish legally enforceable levels for 6 PFAS substances in drinking water. So again, PFOA and PFOS, PFNA, PFHXS, PFBS, and those Gen X chemicals. And this proposal is also part of that strategic roadmap that I referenced earlier. So EPA also proposed some maximum contaminant level goals for these 6 PFAS substances, but those are not enforceable. Those are non-enforceable public health goals. So just given the time we have, I won't spend time discussing those. But I wanted to focus on those MCLs. MCLs are in fact enforceable standards, and they set a maximum level of contaminant permitted in drinking water. So the proposal, if finalized, would regulate PFOA and PFOS as individual contaminants, but would regulate those 4 other PFAS substances, PFNA, PFHXS, PFBS, and Gen X as a mixture. EPA specifically proposes a maximum contaminant level, an MCL, of 4 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS, so very small amounts. And EPA indicated that these levels are the lowest feasible levels for which PFOA and PFOS could be removed from drinking water. The 4 part per trillion level also, I think, represents the lowest of these chemicals that can be reliably detected by laboratories on a broader scale or just generally. And what's also notable here is to date, this level is below any state-issued MCL. So if finalized, these proposed regulations will require that public water systems monitor for these chemicals, notify the public, and reduce PFAS contamination if the levels exceed the proposed standards. I said this before, I'll say it again. This will be the first ever national drinking water standard for these 6 PFAS substances if it's finalized. And just to round this out, as you can see, there's been a flurry of federal activity around PFAS. And we're just expecting this to only continue given the administration's stated goals.
I really appreciate that, Simone. There's so much content in that strategic roadmap, and I think it's really emblematic of that sort of whole government approach that the administration's been taking that you were describing. I think that there was a recent update to the PFAS strategic roadmap, and I'd recommend folks take a look at that because I think it's interesting to sort of check in and see what does it look like now we're a few years in, how are things looking and what is the progress looking like on these. I think it's also worth emphasizing just how small the limits are that Simone was describing, 4 parts per trillion. I think I was talking to someone who said it's like a grain of sand in, I think it was 8 Olympic-sized swimming pools. So we're talking about really, really small amounts of these chemicals being regulated. It's what can be detected in using the equipment that's available to detect PFOA. So it's a really small quantities. And I think looking at the federal laws is really interesting because you see this chemical by chemical approach to PFAS, because that's the way that these laws were written, is that you look at a particular chemical, you propose regulations, or you propose that it fits within the framework of CERCLA using this set of reasoning, and it goes through the process. And then once it's designated, that particular PFAS is listed and all those regulations apply. We've been seeing, however, at the state level, a really different set of approaches to PFAS. And Avi, I'd like to bring you in on this. What has the sort of the state side approach to PFAS regulation looked like? I previewed that it looks different. So does it?
Yes. I mean, I think even at the federal level, you're beginning to see the approach towards a class, which is the hazard index for the four as a mixture. Doesn't go far enough nearly in that direction, but it begins to get at that problem of the ubiquity of this chemical and the different forms of the chemical. Um, you're also, of course, there's history of regulating federally at things like PCBs, which have been regulated more broadly. So I think there's precedent for that as well. I think at the state level, especially in the space of looking at PFAS use in product categories, the states have taken a very broad approach, I would say. There are right now 22 different states, as I mentioned, that use that broad definition of PFAS. And they've been active in a variety of different product categories, some at the regulatory level, some at the legislative level, primarily legislative, but some in regulations as well. The two states that have been most active from a regulatory perspective are California and Washington. Washington has regulated PFAS in multiple product categories at this point, including things like stain resistance after market treatments and in carpets and rugs and so forth. And California has actually acted on those two categories as well. But perhaps the most active area in the states has been state legislation focused on PFAS in various product categories. So just to give you a sense of some of the areas that states have acted on: food packaging, carpets and rugs, fabric treatments, juvenile products, ski wax, cookware, dental floss, cleaning products, menstrual products, personal care products, textiles and apparel, and pesticides. Those have all been legislated in various different states. To date, PFAS and firefighting foam, about 12 states have acted on that. PFAS and foodware, about 12 states have acted on that. And there's a federal ban on PFAS in meals ready to eat. There's restrictions on what can be labeled compostable or recyclable. There are California and New York both acted to ban PFAS in clothing and textiles. 8 states have restricted PFAS in carpets and rugs, and 6 in aftermarket treatments that are aftermarket sprays for stain resistance and water resistance. Some have banned it specifically in furniture and or furnishings, like Colorado or Washington or Minnesota. And then there's been bans on PFAS in cosmetics and personal care products in, I think, 3 different states, PFAS in juvenile products in 3 states, and there have been a couple of broad phase-outs, Maine being the most recent, Minnesota being the most recent. Minnesota, just to give you an example what it did, it banned PFAS broadly. It says sales of products containing intentionally added PFAS are banned after 2032 unless they are designated currently unavoidable. It prohibits specifically 11 product categories starting in 2025, and it authorizes the state agency to act proactively on other product categories. It also requires manufacturers of products with intentionally added PFAS to report the PFAS starting in 2026. So you can sort of see the direction things are headed in. There've been laws that have been passed focusing on specific categories. Firefighting foam was the initial point of regulation for many states. But since then, more and more categories have been regulated or legislated, and increasingly states are looking at broader vehicles. So Minnesota has taken the broadest approach, but states like Colorado, which banned PFAS in 10 different categories, and New York has introduced a bill to ban PFAS in 6 or 7 different categories. That's the direction things are headed. And of course, states are also acting on water standards as well, and some states have taken a index type approach in the past as well. So.
No, that's a really helpful sort of overview of what's going on. And of course, at the state level, we're seeing parallel activities to a lot of what Simone was describing at the federal level. States like Washington, where I sit, have taken action under their version of Superfund to cover PFAS as a class. There was a designation of PFAS as a class as falling under what's called MOTCA, the Model Toxic Control Act. That this that the entire set falls within within that jurisdiction. But we're also seeing within the safe drinking water context activity there. I saw a question about air activity as well as soil. Within the soil context, we're also seeing maximum limits being set. Within the air context, I haven't seen a lot, but I'm interested to hear if folks have thoughts on air. Feel free to send on the chat, or we could host a future webinar on those issues. And I heard you mention a few features that have become consistent, and I'd like, if you don't mind, if we could just drill in on a couple of
Sure.
those terms that you're using. One that keeps coming up is intentionally added PFAS. And I know that different states are taking different approaches as they think about this ubiquitous chemical that can be found in so many different places and inadvertently in products as well. What is intentional addition, and how are states sort of dealing with that balancing act of what are folks adding on purpose and what is incidental contamination?
Sure. There's a couple of different, states are taking somewhat different approaches on that, but most broadly speaking, anytime PFAS are added to a product, that's an intentionally added PFAS, and that's the most common sort of use of that phrase in state legislation. Some states are going beyond that. So for instance, California says not only that it's any intentionally added PFAS, many of the laws say any PFAS above a given threshold. And that's to capture, use in manufacturing that ends up or in or on the product. Some states have actually gone so far as to say if you're using it in manufacturing, it's a known use. It's reasonably anticipated to end up on the product, and that's an intentional use. And I think that's a very reasonable place to go with that, because it's a predictable outcome if you're using it on a particular kind of a releaser, for instance, and it ends up on the product. And so given the levels at which concerns exist for this, we're increasingly seeing a trend, I think, to have those kinds of uses accounted for in the definition of intentionally added. But to date, it's primarily been about actual addition to the product.
Yeah, and I've
But
seen
with a change coming. So.
Yeah, and I've seen sort of the idea is that you're adding it for a functional effect. There's
Yes.
the purpose to the use of the PFAS. You're adding it in order to get water resistance or stain resistance or something like that. And then
Yes.
there's this sort of related, here's a limit of sort of the background contamination levels, especially as more research is done on just testing products and what does this actually look like.
Yeah, I would say that, the first part, it's a technical or functional effect in the product, or if it's a intentional breakdown product, like, for instance, intentional product or something you add to the product. So for instance, plastic containers are fluorinated. That's an intentional, the PFAS that are formed on that plastic is an intentional result of that fluorination process. And so that would be accounted for in that scenario. And in terms of the thresholds, those are capturing use at that level, whether that's intentionally added or that's a result of contamination from industrial processes or not. So.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting set of implications as you're thinking about the broad uses. I mean, everything from plastic mold releases using PFAS, gaskets, all kinds of different applications in the industrial setting. It's PFAS really is everywhere. I saw in the chat there was mention or Q&A. There's a question about AstroTurf, and I know that in some applications, there are some applications of PFAS in the extrusion of the AstroTurf, and there's been a lot of coverage of potential PFAS issues in the AstroTurf industry. That's another product area where I know California was interested in regulating. I know there's been a lot of activity out here in Washington. So there are going to be more and more categories of products falling into these regulations. And I guess as we've done some looking back, what is the last few years? It's been an absolute whirlwind of a couple of years, I will say, in the PFAS world, as these things are being generated. Looking ahead at 2024, looking ahead at the year's webinars that we've got ahead, what are you both looking at? What is sort of your North Star as we start to look at 2024? Is there anything that you're paying attention to? Simone, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. So focusing on just how, just the litigation behind the PFAS related litigation, obviously, and you referenced at the outset, James, the AFFF, MDL, but just watching and sort of monitoring the plaintiff's bar's attempt to leverage PFAS regulations, PFAS guidance. One of the things we're looking at is just, although the maximum contaminant levels, for example, are just proposed, then they have also started to feature pretty prominently in litigation, even though they're not even finalized. So watching to see how attorneys are attempting to leverage those. Also watching to the technology. As I mentioned earlier on, there's a concern that maybe the regulations, the technology can't keep up with the regulations. So how do you test for PFAS substances at such small levels, for example? And then how do you also test for a class of substances that can range in number between anywhere between 5 and 9,000 substances, and sort of what that looks like on a broader scale.
Yeah, no, I know this is a concern, and I'm hoping to highlight some testing related topics in future webinars. There are really interesting ways that states are dealing with sort of the testing problem. You know, you can test for individual chemicals, and we've got sort of a growing family of chemicals that you can test for and a growing set of media. But how do you do this sort of class-wide approach? And you might hear about tests like total fluorine or total organic fluorine. And I'm hoping to highlight some of those developments. I know that ASTM is currently, as we speak, convening, maybe not as we speak, I don't think they currently have a meeting, but they are meeting to talk about implementing or recommending or studying a potential unified test method for total organic fluorine within the product set. So I'm really glad you shouted out the technological changes that we're going to see spurred through these regulations and sort of the way that they've been scoped. Avi, what are you looking at for 2024 in PFAS land?
I think we're going to see states acting more broadly, as I mentioned. You've already seen some states do broad regulation in the form of Minnesota and Maine. More states doing multi-category bills to ban PFAS in various applications, or in products, I should say. And I think we're going to continue to see states act on things like water standards and leading the way, actually, I think, with which states have been doing on both fronts a lot of the time. The other thing I think California will likely be looking at broad legislation to sort of the essential use approach, to say we shouldn't be using PFAS unless it's absolutely necessary. And I think as you alluded to, there are increasingly tests. Most of the bills that have passed refer to PFAS as a class and talk about measuring in all PFAS essentially, and the California laws specifically refer to total organic fluorine as the measurement. And then there are tests out there that are already being performed to meet the laws that have already passed. And there are tests available to look at that, and they're increasingly being developed to get there. So I think we're going to continue to see states continue to be active. We're going to continue to see them act as broadly as possible to eliminate these, because they are being found everywhere. They are being found in water, and they are more prevalent often in the water of communities that face other environmental burdens. And so I think that trend of states being in the lead is likely to continue.
I appreciate that. Thank you. And no one asked me, but as moderator, I'm going to go ahead and ask myself. I do think it's going to be interesting to see, as all of these proposed regulations are finalized, what does it look like as these federal activities are put on the books, and what does this actual enforcement guidance end up looking like? I'm also interested to see what state enforcement over the next year starts to look like. In places like California, where the Attorney General has put out essentially an enforcement warning letter to the cookware industry specifically. What does it look like as AGs become, or state AGs become an enforcement vector in the PFAS space, where up to this point, it's been mostly private litigants, at least in the product space, looking to get involved, specifically with a focus on things like greenwashing or false advertising. So I'm interested to see what that looks like over the next year. I think we're going to see quite a bit of development as these regulations are now on the books at the state level and will become finalized at the federal level.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point, James, the greenwashing point, because a lot of the consumer litigation in particular focuses on advertising and representation. So they're largely not personal injury type cases. Plaintiffs largely have not, in the consumer context, plaintiffs largely have not come forward saying that they suffered any type of harm, physical harm as a result of PFAS exposure. It's more so a company or the defendants represented a product as being a certain way and or natural or all natural, and it hasn't been the case. So I take your point, and I certainly agree with you that I think that we can expect just in this new year that you're going to see a lot more greenwashing claims attributed with consumer products because plaintiffs are going to allege that those are not, products are not environmentally friendly, or they're not sustainable, or they're not clean, because they contain PFAS substances.
So with that, I'm excited to enter the Q&A portion. The Q&A has been very active. Thank you all for submitting questions, and please feel free to continue to do so while we address a few of these. I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them, but there are a couple that I wanted to highlight off the bat because I realized we didn't actually get into them, despite my promises. So Avi, in a number of these state laws, for instance, let's pull out Maine. Maine has this broad ban of PFAS in consumer products in 2030. And embedded in this law, they're currently working on this regulation. They say that unless they're banned unless a currently unavoidable use is designated, and the state agency has the authority to designate these essential uses of PFAS in products. Could you talk a little bit? I know that that's sort of core to NRDC's work in this space and advocacy in this space. What is there any alignment on what an unavoidable use or an essential use looks like, and how this will operationalize as we go forward?
Yes, so there is an essential use framework that has been put forward by a group of scientists, including scientists at NRDC, and it revolves around three different statements that there are no safer alternatives to the chemical available, that the function of the chemical is necessary for the product to work, and that the chemical is being used in a product that is critical for health, safety, or the functioning of society. We expect these three criteria to be at play in any essential use framework. Safer alternatives and health, safety, and functioning of society are explicitly mentioned in the two laws that have passed around the essential use framework so far, which are in Maine and Minnesota. And the other is sort of an articulation of something that is inherent in looking at that. And so for something to be essential, there shouldn't be any safer alternatives that are available for use. All three of those criteria have to be met, in other words. So no safer alternatives to the chemical available. The function is necessary for the product to work. An example might be there that, you have pants that have stain resistance on them. You don't need stain resistance for the pants to work. And then finally, the chemical is being used in a product that is critical for health, safety, or the functioning of society. That's a harder question to answer, but you don't have to get there if you can answer the other two, because if the other two criteria are met, then the use is not essential. And so that's sort of the idea. And the idea is also, it's not a fixed idea. It's not like forever essential. So that changes with developments in the science, in technology. And the idea is that as things develop and we no longer need it for certain kinds of uses, that we can eliminate them and move them out of use, so that we're not continuing to expose people to these harmful chemicals. So that's the basic idea. Happy to walk through any of that if that's if that's helpful. So
I just wanted to raise, I won't spend a ton of time on it. I know we have only like 6 minutes left, but just wanted to raise and just to highlight for folks. I think it was late last year, and it goes along with what we were talking about, the point Avi was making, and James as well. The Department of Defense issued a report last year, and that report was mandated by Congress. But what's important about this report is that it cautions Congress and federal regulatory agencies from taking this broad, sweeping, and I think they characterize it as a structural approach to banning or restricting PFAS substances. And in doing so, they sort of highlighted the need for certain PFAS substances and saying that by severely restricting them or banning them, doing so could impact not only society, but our national security there. So it was a pretty interesting and groundbreaking report that I would encourage folks to read if you have a moment.
I mean, I think what I'll add is there's a lot of claims of this chemical is absolutely essential for XYZ function. The beauty of the essential use approach is, of course, that can be taken into account. You know, the idea is PFAS at PFAS, and then if you think that if a manufacturer or user thinks that use is really essential for something, is really needed for something essential, then they can come and make that point and show that there are no alternatives, that a product, that the function provided by the chemical for the product is truly necessary for the product to function, and that it's truly necessary, the use of that chemical in that product is truly necessary for the health, well-being, and functioning of society. And if they can make those showings, they're allowed to use it for X period of time until they can, while trying to make efforts to improve and get out of the harmful chemical. So I think that's one of the benefits of that approach, is that it builds the need for PFAS in certain products at the moment. It's built into the process, so that you can take that into account, but still move us in the direction of eliminating those chemicals wherever possible, getting rid of the unnecessary uses. And so that's, I think, part of the reason we're advocating for that essential use framework.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, this sort of essential use framework, we're seeing it in play in the state of Washington as they are studying product categories and then studying alternative materials, and then whether there are viable alternative materials that or chemistries that allow you to do whatever the function is for that PFAS is being used for in that case. I think it's an interesting framework that's being implemented at the state level. And at the federal level, we've got these sort of arguments about different uses for PFAS. And Simone, I appreciate you bringing up this report from DoD about some of the military uses of PFAS and the functional uses of PFAS there. We've had a lot of questions about some of the litigation around different aspects of PFAS regulation. I don't think we're going to be able to get into any of those in detail today. Conscious of the time that we have here with just 2 minutes left, I think the only thing that I have time for is to thank our panelists here for being such wonderful guests on the first monthly PFAS briefing. I'm really glad that we could feature you both. And I think you highlight just how much activity there is in the world of PFAS, how this is going to be developing going forward, as well as my and I think ELI's vision for this kind of space, which is to bring people together who are all working on PFAS in very in different fields, in different circumstances, in different workplaces. We're all environmental lawyers who are working on this on this chemical because it's one of the great challenges of our time. So I'm really grateful for both of you being here with me today. I hope everyone who attended found it useful, and I hope that you will join us next month, where we will be talking about the AFFF MDL, the aqueous film forming foam litigation out in South Carolina. And Madison, I think I need to pass it back to you to close us out.
Thank you so much. I want to give a huge thank you to James, Avi, and Simone for being here today. We're so grateful to them for taking the time to join us this afternoon to have this important discussion. Thank you as well to our audience for tuning in, and thank you so much for asking those great questions. We're sorry we couldn't get to all of them. As a reminder, though, this will be a series throughout 2024. On the fourth Tuesday of each month, we'll be here at 12 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time for a new PFAS briefing. We're excited to continue to provide ELI members with the latest updates in PFAS regulation, as well as unique special topics each month. Please register on the ELI website for all future sessions. We put the links to the webpage that you can register for all the sessions on in the chat. Additionally, if you'd like to purchase the PFAS Deskbook, we've put a discount code, Pollack15, in the chat. I believe it will also be emailed out to you all as well for attending. With that, our first session of this series has come to an end. We'll see you next month for a discussion about PFAS litigation. Thank you and have a great day, everybody.